quarterback carousel continues to spin this offseason. Matt Ryan was traded to the Colts on Monday for a third-round pick. Ryan has played his entire career in Atlanta since being drafted in 2008. He won an MVP with the team in 2016, led Atlanta to its second ever Super Bowl appearance. Indianapolis will have their seventh quarterback in 7 years with Matt Ryan, their seventh week one starting quarterback, a trend that started with the surprise retirement of Andrew Luck in 2019. Kyle, you often refer to Matt Ryan as a rotting corpse. Will the move to Indianapolis do that body some good?
The rotting corpse of Matt Ryan. Thank you for bringing that up. I love saying it every time we bring it up. The rotting corpse of Matt Ryan.
It's kind of like zombified now. Now he's kind of like a football zombie, I would say.
I would say that he is one hit away from being Ben Roethlisberger. And fortunately, he's going to a team that has some measure of an offensive line. So he will avoid that hit for as long as he possibly can. Because it's just one. It's just one away from being Ben Roethlisberger. Ben Roethlisberger injured his elbow and was never the same. Matt Ryan's like that one knee or arm injury away from never being the same. And fortunately, the Colts can milk 1 year out of him before they inevitably need to find another quarterback next year. Now, technically, Matt Ryan's under contract for 2 seasons at a roughly $28 and $21 million cap hit. But if the Colts so choose, they can move off of Matt Ryan next year with very minimal penalty. And I'm very fascinated from the Colts standpoint of it. But from the Matt Ryan standpoint, he got to pick the place he wanted to go. And he picked a pretty good place to ride out the last couple of years of his career.
It's kind of like Matthew Stafford deciding he wanted to go play in LA, not as shiny as the glitz and glamour of Los Angeles, obviously, but Matt Ryan going to Indianapolis is certainly a team in which he has a chance to compete. Now, the one thing I will push back on, and doing a little bit of research into the Indianapolis Colts and what this would mean for Matt Ryan, PFF actually had the Colts as a mid-level offensive line. So they were rated 12 overall, but did you know that PFF had them as the 30th graded pass blocking offensive line? They actually allowed the most quarterback hits in 2021. Now, I will grant you that Quentin Nelson missed 4 games last year, but that still is such a striking mark of a team that we kind of view as, again, one of the solid offensive lines. You don't even think about them getting hit. I've heard this theory thrown out there that Carson Wentz makes offensive lines worse. The Philadelphia Eagles also had a pretty damn good offensive line, but those last couple of years of Carson Wentz, you start to notice, oh, this offensive line might not be as good as we thought. Now Jalen Hurts is there, and you're like, okay, maybe the Philadelphia Eagles do have a good offensive line again. The Colts, could that be another similar story? Like Matt Ryan, who's more of a timing pocket passer, not going to ad lib as much. Is he going to make sure that that offensive line produces at a better clip this season?
So I'm glad that you brought up QB hits and QB pressures as stats for sure, because Carson Wentz falls into the same camp as Russell Wilson in that QB hits and QB sacks are not offensive line stats. They are quarterback stats. You can throw the ball away as a quarterback. If you take sacks, it's on the quarterback. It's not on the offensive line. It's on the quarterback. Russell Wilson led the league in sacks every year, and that's on the quarterback. It's the same thing with Joe Burrow, where Joe Burrow takes a lot of sacks. His offensive line wasn't great, but he also holds onto the ball too long and he gets sacked and hit a lot. Now he has less time than other quarterbacks as well, but that's besides the point there. Carson Wentz does make your offensive line worse. I'm not sure if it's 30th in pass blocking, but I guess when we say the Colts have a strong offensive line, it's the Colts have Quentin Nelson, and Quentin Nelson could retire tomorrow and have a first ballot Hall of Fame resume. He's been in the league 4 years and has made All-Pro 3 times.
Well, go that
first team All-Pro 3 times.
He's not getting Sandy Koufax treatment. He's not at Luke Kuechly levels yet.
3 first-team All-Pros. Richard Seymour just got in the Hall of Fame with 2.
But Luke Kuechly was good too, and Luke Kuechly, he at least had an 8-year career. 4-year career, you still have some work to do. I'm sorry. There's
sure, okay. He has to hit the bare minimum threshold to make it. He plays 6 years, he'll make the Hall of Fame. He could do nothing the rest of his career.
If it takes you 5 years post-retirement to get into the Hall of Fame, I think you have to at least play, let's say, 5 years. Not that it's a set standard, but I think that is a reasonable measure. But we're not here to talk about Quentin Nelson and his Hall of Fame resume. We're here to talk about Matt Ryan and how this helps the Colts. The division, you look around them, I know you don't think much of Tennessee. Tennessee had some movement this offseason. They let go of Julio Jones, which Julio was just never a big move for them. Julio was a big move in principle. Last season, I remember talking to our friend Steezy about it, and he called it the pick your poison offense, and it just never materialized. It looks like the Titans were drinking some poison because they were one of the most injured teams on offense last year. Insert Robert Woods. Will that make the offense better? Well, it's really going to depend on if Ryan Tannehill makes any level of improvement. Look at the Jags. Doug Peterson's first year there. He's still improving. He has to fix this team or undo whatever mess that they feel that Urban Meyer left over for him. And then Houston is a team in an interesting spot. Now they have some draft picks to work with because of the Deshaun Watson trade. I don't think they're quite tanking anymore. I think tanking was really last year. I think now they're going to try and build off it. I don't underrate Lovie Smith as much as you do. I still look at him as a coach that brought a Chicago Bears team to a Super Bowl and is at least a professional guy. I think you might see some improvement there. The question for them is always just going to be like Davis Mills. What are they going to get out of him? Davis Mills, there's some believers, there's some doubters. The answer probably lies somewhere in between on where Davis's ability is going to become. I can look at the Colts, though. I can look at the Colts and say last year they should have been in the playoffs. I can't believe they were not in the playoffs. I can't believe they lost a Week 18 game against the Jacksonville Jaguars to miss the playoffs. I was praising Carson Wentz, 27 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. I thought he was having a great year, but even when you just look at those base numbers, the eye test would tell you Carson Wentz, he just crumbles. He crumbles in these big moments. He has those left-handed spinning alley-oop throws that end up in the other person's arm for a pick six. And that's part of the problem with Carson Wentz. Matt Ryan isn't going to do that. Matt Ryan isn't that type of quarterback. Matt Ryan, while he's not flashy anymore, he's never had the biggest arm. He is a former league MVP for a reason. And that is because Matt Ryan can do what you ask him to do. One thing that has hurt Matt Ryan immensely the last couple of years in Atlanta, the fact that Atlanta has just not had a running game since 2016, his MVP year.
I would go a little further. I would just say Atlanta has not had talent since his MVP season.
But that's part of it. That's part of the fact that they haven't had talent. They haven't had talent at the running back position. Devontae Freeman started to flatline after that season. Tevin Coleman wasn't quite the same guy.
Oh, yes. And then Tevin Coleman, Mr. 18 carries for 72 yards. And then they never really
picked up a running game beyond that. In fact, the Atlanta run game has been horrible. They have been bottom half since 2017. In the last couple seasons, they've been bottom 5. And we talked about this a little bit off air. A good running game doesn't necessarily make you a good team, but it does hide any blemishes that your quarterback may have, any limitations that your quarterback may have. If you could just hide some of the blemishes of Matt Ryan at this point in his career, he's going to do enough to help you win ball games. He's going to make 1 to 2 throws a game that are going to increase your odds of winning. And the Colts have that team. They just needed the right man at the ship, at least for 2 years. It's fine. You're acquiring another old guy. That's the big problem. You're acquiring another old guy. So even in best case scenario, how many years left can Matt Ryan give you? How many good years left can Matt Ryan give you? The Colts still have to almost look for a future quarterback, even while acquiring Matt Ryan.
Okay, so in those 4 minutes that you broke down there was a lot of good stuff in there. So there's like 3 points that I'm trying to keep in my head to circle back to because they were very good.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, it was okay. So the first thing was the Titans, and the Titans was interesting because I'm not necessarily down on the Titans. I think the Titans are so dependent on the success of Derrick Henry, and like the bet would be a mid-20s running back coming off of a major leg injury when he's had like 400 carries the last 2 seasons. Like the bet is to say the Titans are going to get worse. Now, Derrick Henry is like the super freak of super freak running backs, and he has defied all the rules of the running back position. So like it's possible that it works out, but it's just not as good of a bet as saying the Chiefs, Chargers, Broncos, Raiders, unfortunately Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Buffalo, and now Miami have all also gotten better as well. You know, last year they were the 6th best team in the AFC. And so I assume some of those teams will jump the Tennessee Titans. This division feels like the most easy to pick, like non-NFC East or NFC South. Like it seems like Colts, Titans, Jaguars, Texans is how this thing is stacked up, because rare is the division where one team is in like each category of NFL teams. Like there's the Super Bowl contenders, there's the above average teams, there's the below average teams, and then there's the tanking teams. And I'm not saying the Colts are like Super Bowl contender good, but we both kind of agree, like we could have seen the Colts doing what the Bengals did last year. Like the Colts were as good as them.
Oh yeah. You know, and I never even got to expand on this take. I wanted to bring this up last season, but obviously the Colts blew their last 2 games. If they made it in the playoffs, I would have picked them almost as a dark horse Super Bowl team. Not saying it would have happened, but I could have saw them as dark horse, as much of a dark horse as the Cincinnati Bengals were. But because of the last 2 weeks, what can I do?
Yeah, it all fell apart there. But this one feels pretty clear because it feels like each one is in a different tier. Like the Titans are now like 9th or 10th best team in the AFC. Jaguars are going to go 6-11. Like signing those players makes them better. It just doesn't make them good enough to actually compete. compete because mid-level free agents are not enough to make you a competitive football team. And then the Texans are going for the number 1 pick. I don't care if what the organization wants to do. They're so bad that they're going to have a top 4 pick in the draft. I'm not sure if it's going to be number 1, but they're so bad that they're going to have a top 4 pick in the NFL draft.
Blow for Bryce.
Blow for Bryce, suck for Stroud, whatever you want to do it. I like when it's B and S because those are easy ones to do, or lose for Lawrence, little situations like that. But that part was interesting. The other part that was interesting that you mentioned many, many times back, I'm trying to circle back to, is Matt Ryan does throw interceptions at a pretty high rate. It's just he doesn't have the volatility of a Carson Wentz. Like, the joke with Matt Ryan is that he underthrows everybody. And as much as we don't admit it, the Colts don't have a great wide receiver core. I know people like Michael Pittman. I know he was a fantasy hero for me, but the Colts don't have a good receiving core.
He's a big body, and he's more of a red zone threat than Julio ever was.
That's true, but that's a low bar to hit. Like a low bar, Julio at the end for the Falcons as a red zone threat is a low bar to hit. That doesn't necessarily mean that your questions are solved there. So yeah, their game is going to be built on running the football. They're in a similar position to the Titans where they're going to just use the holy hell out of Jonathan Taylor while he's still on the rookie contract. And if they had Andrew Luck, they wouldn't use the holy hell out of Jonathan Taylor. They would throw the ball more. They would get more receivers, kind of like what the Dolphins have done, even though I don't know if that's going to work out for them trading for Tyreek Hill. They're doing what the personnel says they should do. And the personnel says we should probably run the ball more because we have maybe the best running back in the NFL who is still only 22 years old, and we can destroy his body and go, run the ball for 1,500 yards.
Here's what I'll say about Matt Ryan in relation to the Colts. And I said this about Jimmy Garoppolo, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, in relation to if he would have got traded to the Colts. He just needs to be as good as Philip Rivers was 2 years ago. If he's that version of quarterback for them, then I think they'll be fine. You mentioned last year, throughout the year even, that had certain things broke down in that Buffalo Bills game, Philip Rivers would lead the Colts to a playoff victory. And I think that's probably what the Colts are asking for from Matt Ryan this year. Can you at least win us a playoff game? Can we get into the playoffs? And can you at least win us one? I think obviously every team is in a pursuit of a Super Bowl. I don't think that's necessarily the Colts this year. And I don't think that the Colts are necessarily asking Matt Ryan to be that quarterback this year. But if you could at least get us into the playoffs, that's an improvement. And if I'm Frank Reich and I'm on the hot seat, I need to get into the playoffs and I need to win in the playoffs.
So this is the fascinating part for me of why I'm so fascinated by the Colts organization, because more than any other team, the Colts run their organization differently than everyone else in the league. You know how the joke every year we make is the Colts are always top 5 in cap space every year? The Colts only sign 1-year contracts. They only get big time players for 1 year so that they are never locked into poor contracts. Now, Darius Leonard, they'll sign him to a 5-year deal because he's Darius Leonard. Quentin Nelson, they'll sign him to a 5-year deal because he's Quentin Nelson. DeForest Buckner, 5-year contract. Those guys are special good players, but they aren't alluded to the fact that in free agency, it's always good to have flexibility because teams almost always end up regretting those 4 or 5-year long-term contracts, whether it be, we joke every year about the Jaguars spending $200 million in free agency, or the Patriots spending last year, or the Jets, or the Lions, or the Giants. Someone spends a ton of money in free agency. They get better the first year, and then they have no cap space the rest of the way. The Colts signed Devin Funchess to 1-year contracts. They traded for Yannick Ngakoue, which is essentially a 1-year, $13 million contract. If you look at the contract language, it's basically they can cut him for no penalty next year. It's basically a 1-year, $13 million contract. They signed T.Y. Hilton this last year to a 1-year contract. They seem to always value the flexibility of cap space. And I think the reason for that is they don't have any other players worthy of giving the money to. They gave it to Andrew Luck, and then Andrew Luck retired. I think if they had Andrew Luck, they would go all in to try and win a championship. But because in 2018, they were the first team to draft 2 all-pro rookie teammates since Dick Butkus and Gale Sayers, with Darius Leonard in the second round, Quentin Nelson in the first round. Because they have that core, they're building something sustainable, but unfortunately, they just haven't gotten the quarterback to build such a sustainable team yet. Or, like an Aaron Donald type also suffices. But more specifically, they haven't gotten the quarterback in the last 4 years that'll take them from being a team that loses to the Chiefs and Bills of the world world to a team that can compete with the Chiefs and Bills of the world.
And the question that I have there is just like what their pathway to a quarterback is, or a sustainable long-term option at quarterback. I'd love to say hook 'em horns and saying Sam Ehlinger is the next solution there at quarterback, but that's frankly not going to be the case. You look at this year's offseason transactions at quarterback, Aaron Rodgers deciding to stay in Green Bay was probably the big wild card for them because obviously buddies, Pat McAfee knows Jim Irsay. Who knows? Maybe that could have been a connection that I could saw happening if Aaron Rodgers wasn't opposed to staying in the Midwest. Russell Wilson deciding to go with Denver. You figured Denver was going to make a hard push at a quarterback. One way or the other, they've been putting their cards on the table that we're going to make a transaction like this for years. Matthew Stafford deciding he wanted to go to sunny Los Angeles instead of staying in the Midwest. Again, another move that you understand geographically, he just wanted to go to that location. And that's fine because you get to go with a talented Hall of Fame head coach in Sean McVay. And then you look at the last major chip, Deshaun Watson. And in the division, I know you say always go for the best trade you possibly get, but the Houstons don't want to see Deshaun Watson in their division consistently year after year, because while they're tanking right now, they want to get better. They want to be like every other franchise and get better. They want to get back to the playoffs. And if Deshaun Watson is constantly impeding your pursuit of even winning your division, that is not a long-term recipe for success, especially because Deshaun Watson, if he keeps his nose clean for the next decade, he's going to be in the league for a long time. The Houston Texans don't want any part of that. So there's a problem there, and they're good. That's another problem. It's almost a problem that they're good because they'll never be at the top part of the draft to also get one of those elite guys unless they do something drastic like the 49ers did, trade multiple first-round picks.
Which they tried to do last year. That was underreported. They tried to trade for the number 3 pick in the draft, but they couldn't get up there because they had the 21 pick in the draft, and they traded it for Carson Wentz before they got Carson Wentz in February. They tried to trade for the number 3 pick in the draft, and they just couldn't get there. So they've tried every option possible to get that quarterback, and every single time they get denied. Why? Because if you take away the quarterback position, the Colts have like the 12th best roster in the NFL. And so they keep every year attracting the 12th best quarterback in the NFL. It's Phillip Rivers, it's Carson Wentz, it's Matt Ryan. They just keep attracting tier 3 quarterbacks, and they keep losing to the teams that have tier 1 quarterbacks, and also the Jacksonville Jaguars.
And it's so interesting that mostly they keep getting these veterans. They keep getting the Phillip Rivers types. They keep getting a Matt Ryan type. When are they going to get like a young guy that they could just try and work with? Hell, if they would have went out there and got Jameis and see what that turned into, that might have been something, because at least Jameis, bare minimum, you said he's a talented guy. Actually, that's a big indictment on Carson Wentz. Now, the more I think about it, you actually went out there and got a young guy, or a guy that had a promising future, at least when we thought about him in 2017. And you said after a year, we can't stand this guy. Not only can we not win with this guy, we can't stand this guy, and we can't get him out soon enough. And that's going to be a thing that I think is going to follow Carson Wentz around for the entire rest of his
also
career.
Frank Reich, because
Frank Reich, yes, because they had that connection. They were two guys. They had the same Bible verse. They shared that connection. They were connected at the hip in Philly. I vouch for this guy. I'm going to the owner, and I'm going to vouch for this guy. And apparently Frank Reich reportedly apologized to the owner and Chris Ballard that he vouched for Carson Wentz. So if you're Frank Reich, you hope this Matt Ryan thing works, because you are on the hottest of hot seats, buddy. I don't care. If you get to the playoffs, I don't think that that's going to be good enough for Jim Irsay, because he's a good owner, but not a great owner. I would say he's somewhat meddlesome enough to cause issues for a team, but he's also doesn't get in the way of this team being a competitive roster either. Jim Irsay is somewhere in the middle. If we're tier ranking NFL owners, I would say he's about a mid-tier owner, and that's fine. Jim Irsay, at least, he's a personality. And I'm watching this documentary about the Lakers. He's kind of like a Jerry Buss type, really, and that's fine.
Sort of just Jerry Buss with more alcoholism. It feels like with Jim Irsay, which I feel bad about joking about alcoholism, but when it's Jim Irsay, it's a little more okay, I suppose. But even still, I think Kyle, that
I'll drink to that.
That was a good joke. I would give a little chuckle to that. But to the point about the Colts, like the thing that they've done is they haven't locked themselves into, like, I really respect the restraint of the Colts to be like, we value sustainability above all else. And every single stopgap guy they've gotten, whether it's Brissett, whether it's Phillip Rivers, whether it's Carson Wentz, now Matt Ryan, they're all 1-year contracts. All of the contracts are set up. Now they got Carson Wentz for 2 years. Unfortunately, like they took
Wentz was supposed to be the stopgap. He was supposed to be the guy. He was supposed to be the guy.
they set it up to protect themselves 2 years, and they took less on the trade in order to have Washington take him. They only got 2/3 for Carson, which makes it more insane that the Falcons got 1/3 for Matt Ryan, if 2/3 is what you're getting for Carson Wentz. But I assume the Colts are taking all $40 million of that contract. So it changes the math a little bit there, because now they use that open cap space to get Matt Ryan. They essentially traded Carson Wentz for Matt Ryan and a 3rd round pick. And, that seems kind of fair, right? Like, Carson Wentz for Matt Ryan and a 3rd round pick is a trade most of us would make. Like, they're kind of similar quarterbacks in that respect. You might get the boom of Carson Wentz every now and then, but, that's basically what they're worth. It's Carson Wentz and a shitty contract for Matt Ryan's shitty contract and a 3rd round pick. And it makes the Colts no better or no worse, but I think that will still be good enough for them to make the playoffs, only in a universe where someone has to make the playoffs from the godforsaken AFC South. And I've made the same joke for 6 years. The AFC South exists to get the 4 seed, play a meaningless game on ESPN that very few people will watch, and they will lose to a 5 seed who probably should have won their division.